September 2, 1945. Yokohama Harbor, Japan. The morning sun broke through the lingering haze of coal smoke and sea mist as the USS Missouri sat anchored in Tokyo Bay, her gray hull reflecting in waters that had carried invasion fleets and kamikaze pilots alike. On the docks of Yokohama, beneath the skeletal remains of buildings gutted by B-29 firebombing raids, a group of Japanese women stood in precise formation. They wore the faded remnants of military auxiliary uniforms, some from the Women's Volunteer Corps, others from naval communications units that had tracked American fleets across the Pacific. Their faces, carefully composed into masks of stoic resignation, revealed nothing of the terror that moved like electricity through their rigid spines. They had been ordered to report for processing by the occupation forces, and they had obeyed, as they had been trained to obey, expecting violence, humiliation, perhaps death. The air smelled of salt and ash and the peculiar sweetness of a nation's collapse. And then the Americans arrived, and they were smiling. This detail, the smiles, would appear again and again in the testimonies, diaries, and oral histories collected over the following decades from Japanese women who encountered American occupation forces in those first bewildering weeks after surrender. Not the contemptuous smiles of victors enjoying the abasement of the vanquished, not the leering grins they had been warned to expect from soldiers preparing to commit the atrocities that Japanese military propaganda had promised would follow defeat. These were something else entirely. Open, easy, casual smiles that seemed to originate from some deep well of certainty, untroubled by fear or cruelty or the weight of domination. The Americans smiled the way people smile when they are fundamentally unafraid, when they do not expect violence to erupt at any moment, when they move through the world assuming it will accommodate rather than attack them. For women who had spent years, some their entire adult lives, learning to make themselves small and silent and invisible, except when called upon to serve, these smiles were more disorienting than the defeat itself. They violated every principle that had structured Japanese military culture, every assumption about the relationship between power and suffering, between victor and vanquished, between men and women navigating the aftermath of total war. The smiles suggested a different architecture of human relations, one these women had been taught did not and could not exist. Japan's military mobilization of women had accelerated dramatically after 1943. As the empire's defensive perimeter contracted and the home islands faced the prospect of invasion. The Women's Volunteer Corps, established in 1944, had eventually enrolled over 2 million women in munitions factories, agricultural labor, nursing services, and auxiliary military roles. Female officers, though limited in number and authority, had commanded communications units, administrative sections, and support services essential to the military apparatus. They had been trained in discipline, sacrifice, and the absolute subordination of individual will to collective purpose. They had been taught that their bodies belonged to the emperor, that their lives held value only insofar as they served the nation, that death was preferable to dishonor. The propaganda they had absorbed throughout the war years painted a nightmarish vision of what American occupation would bring. The enemy soldiers, they were told, were barbarous creatures barely restrained by the veneer of civilization, prone to rape and murder. Particularly excited by the prospect of violating Japanese women as revenge for Pearl Harbor and the Pacific campaigns. Military authorities had distributed cyanide capsules to female auxiliaries in some units, with instructions to end their lives rather than fall into American hands. Thousands of civilians on Saipan and Okinawa had committed suicide based on similar warnings, leaping from cliffs or detonating grenades in family groups rather than face the horrors they believed capture would bring. So when the Americans arrived at processing stations throughout occupied Japan in September 1945, the Japanese women who reported for documentation carried with them not just the trauma of defeat, but the specific terror of anticipated sexual violence. They had said goodbye to their families, some of them, believing they would not return. They had hidden razor blades in their clothing or memorized the location of vulnerable veins. They had prepared themselves for martyrdom. Instead, They were offered cigarettes and asked politely through translators to fill out forms. Lieutenant Yoshiko Hasegawa, who had commanded a signals unit monitoring Allied communications in the Philippines before the collapse, described her first encounter with American forces in a testimony recorded in 1978 for the National Diet Library's Oral History Collection. I was ordered to report to the processing center in Yokosuka. I wore my uniform, though it was threadbare and stained. I wanted to face death with whatever dignity remained to me. When I arrived, there were American women, military women, sitting at desks with typewriters and folders. One of them looked up at me and smiled. She gestured to a chair and said something I did not understand, but her tone was gentle, not mocking, not cruel, simply gentle. I sat because I did not know what else to do, and she handed me a form and a pencil. I thought, this is how they will identify my body afterward. But there was no afterward, no violence, no humiliation beyond the inherent humiliation of defeat itself. There was bureaucracy, endless, methodical American bureaucracy, and there were the women administering it. Female officers from the WACs, the Army Nurse Corps, the WAVES, American Red Cross workers, civilian administrators brought in to manage the occupation's social welfare programs. They moved through the processing centers with an efficiency that seemed almost leisurely in its confidence, as if they had never considered the possibility that their authority might be challenged or their safety threatened. They wore clean, pressed uniforms even in the wreckage of post-war Japan. Their hair was styled, not severely pinned as Japanese military regulations required, but shaped into soft waves and rolls that required time and attention, and products that seemed impossibly luxurious in a landscape of total scarcity. They wore lipstick. This detail stunned many of the Japanese women who observed them. American military women wore bright red lipstick while on duty, an adornment that would have been unthinkable in the Imperial Japanese forces, where makeup was considered frivolous at best and a dereliction of feminine duty at worst. But it was not the lipstick itself that carried meaning. It was what the lipstick represented. These American women treated their own appearance, their own comfort, their own femininity as worthy of attention even in the midst of military occupation. They did not apologize for being women while holding authority. They did not minimize themselves or their needs or their desires in order to fit into a military structure. They simply were, fully and unself-consciously, both female and authoritative, both feminine and competent. Reiko Tanaka, who had worked as a translator in the Naval Ministry in Tokyo before the surrender, recalled in an interview conducted in 1991 the moment she understood the significance of the American women's presentation. I was translating for a medical screening, and the American nurse who was conducting the examinations had to reapply her lipstick because it had worn off. She did this in front of everyone, matter-of-factly, using a small mirror from her pocket. In Japan, we would have hidden this. We would have been ashamed to draw attention to our vanity. But she was not ashamed. She was not vain. She was simply maintaining herself the way you would maintain any piece of equipment. Her appearance was part of her competence, not a distraction from it. The smiles, though, the smiles remained the most disorienting element. They seemed to flow from these American women without effort, without calculation. They smiled at each other while working. They smiled at the Japanese women they were processing. They smiled at the male officers they served alongside, neither flirtatiously nor subserviently, but with the easy familiarity of equals engaged in shared work. In Japanese military culture, smiling had been carefully regulated and gendered. Women were expected to smile when serving men, when expressing gratitude, when making themselves pleasant and accommodating. But these were performed smiles, social obligations rather than emotional expressions. Smiling for oneself, from genuine pleasure or amusement, was considered childish and inappropriate for women engaged in serious work. Men in positions of authority never smiled casually. Sternness was a marker of masculine leadership, and the absence of warmth was understood as a sign of strength. The American women violated all of these unspoken rules. They smiled because they were amused by something. They smiled because they were pleased with their work. They smiled in greeting and in parting. They smiled while giving orders and while receiving them. And most bewilderingly, they smiled at the Japanese women without any apparent fear that this openness might be interpreted as weakness or invitation for disrespect. Captain Fumiko Watanabe, who had served in the Army Ministry's Personnel Division, wrote in her diary, discovered after her death in 2003 and subsequently published by her granddaughter, about watching an American WAC officer interact with a male lieutenant colonel. The woman disagreed with him about the scheduling of transport vehicles. She did not defer or apologize or soften her disagreement with submissive language. She stated her position clearly, explained her reasoning, and smiled while doing it. Not an apologetic smile, not a pleading smile, but a smile that suggested she found the conversation itself enjoyable. That disagreement was not dangerous. The colonel listened, considered, and accepted her suggestion. And then he smiled back. In Japan, such an exchange would have been impossible. A woman who contradicted a superior officer would have been removed from her position, possibly arrested. But here, it was simply work. 2. People solving a problem together. The food became the recurring symbol through which these Japanese women understood the chasm between their world and the world the Americans represented. In the autumn of 1945, Japan teetered on the edge of mass starvation. The rice harvest had failed, the distribution system had collapsed, and millions of repatriated soldiers and civilians flooded into the home islands from the dissolved empire. The average ration in Tokyo that fall provided less than 1,500 calories per day, supplemented desperately by black market purchases that many could not afford. People ate acorns, grass, sawdust mixed with flour. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition begged near railway stations. Into this landscape of desperate hunger came the Americans with their incomprehensible abundance. The occupation forces established mess halls that served meals of a quantity and quality that seemed to violate the laws of nature. White bread, soft and sweet. Butter, actual butter, spread thickly. Meat, not the tiny portions eked out in Japan, but substantial servings of beef and pork. Vegetables preserved in cans that kept them fresh and crisp. Coffee, rich and dark. And everywhere, always, the small markers of surplus. Sugar bowls filled to the brim. Salt and pepper freely available. Napkins used once and discarded. The Japanese women who worked in occupation facilities as translators, clerks, and liaisons witnessed American women eating these meals without ceremony, without the ritualized gratitude that Japanese culture demanded in the face of food. They took seconds. They left food on their plates if they were full. They gave food away casually, without expectation of reciprocal obligation. And they smiled while eating, talking and laughing between bites, as if the meal were merely an opportunity for social connection, rather than a sacred act of survival. Keiko Yamamoto, who worked as a translator at General MacArthur's headquarters, described in a 1987 oral history the psychological impact of the American mess hall. I was translating for a meeting that ran through lunch, so they brought food to the conference room. The American woman I was working with, a captain in the WX, offered me half of her sandwich without hesitation, just broke it in half and handed it to me, still smiling. I had not eaten meat in weeks. My family was surviving on rice gruel and wild vegetables, and she gave me this sandwich, ham and cheese and lettuce on soft white bread, as if it were nothing. I tried to refuse because I had been taught never to take food from others, that accepting charity was shameful. She looked confused by my refusal. She said, "Don't be silly, I can't eat all this anyway." Cannot eat all this. In Japan, we had spent 4 years training ourselves to survive on less and less, to take pride in our hunger, to see deprivation as virtue. And here was this woman who could not finish her lunch, giving away abundance without a second thought. The sandwich became, in Yamamoto's memory, a kind of communion, an unwilling participation in a different ideology, one where scarcity was not inevitable and hunger was not noble. The American woman's smile while offering the food, the casualness of the gesture, the assumption that there would be more food, tomorrow and the next day and the day after, all of this encoded a worldview fundamentally at odds with the sacrificial, ethos that had defined Japanese wartime culture. Japanese women had been mobilized for war through appeals to self-abnegation and collective suffering. They had been praised for eating less so soldiers could eat more, for working until they collapsed, for sacrificing their health and their futures to military production. The greatest virtue was to disappear into the collective, to want nothing for oneself, to find meaning only in service to others. Hunger was framed not as a failure of the state to provide, but as an opportunity to demonstrate loyalty through endurance. The American women, eating their abundant meals and smiling, shattered this framework. They suggested that wanting things for oneself was not selfish, that satisfaction was not shameful, that a woman could be well-fed and well-dressed and still be serving her country with honor. They embodied a form of citizenship that did not require the annihilation of self, that assumed the state existed to serve the people rather than the people existing to be consumed by the state. This realization came slowly, through accumulated observations rather than sudden enlightenment. It came in watching American women refuse to eat food they did not like, expressing preferences without apology. It came in watching them share food with each other and with Japanese co-workers without creating obligations. It came in watching them enjoy their meals, savoring flavors, laughing over coffee breaks, treating eating as a pleasure rather than merely a necessary submission to biological need. The smiles accompanied all of it. Smiles of enjoyment, of satisfaction, of uncomplicated pleasure in being alive and fed and safe. These were smiles that Japanese military culture had worked systematically to eliminate. Smiles that suggested individual happiness mattered, that personal contentment was legitimate, that life could be about something other than suffering and service and sacrifice unto death. Lieutenant Haruko Sato, who had commanded a telegraph unit in Manchuria before the Soviet invasion scattered her forces, encountered American occupation personnel in Hokkaido in November 1945. In testimony given in 1995, she described the moment the contradiction became unbearable. I had been taught that Americans were soft, that their comfort made them weak, that our willingness to endure hardship would ultimately defeat their mechanical superiority. I had believed this. I had watched our soldiers go into battle with inadequate weapons and insufficient food, and I had been told their spirit would overcome material disadvantage. But when I saw the American women, I understood that we had been lied to. They were not soft. They were not weak. They were confident, competent, healthy, strong. And they smiled because they had no reason not to smile, because they came from a place where you did not have to choose between strength and happiness, where you could be capable without being miserable. The medical examinations conducted by American military doctors and nurses provided another point of revelatory contrast. Japanese women reporting for health screenings expected perfunctory, humiliating inspections. Instead, they encountered medical professionals who explained procedures, asked permission, provided privacy, and treated their bodies with clinical respect. The American nurses, in particular, demonstrated a matter-of-fact competence combined with interpersonal warmth that confounded expectations. They touched patients gently. They explained diagnoses in terms patients could understand, working through translators with patients. They showed concern for comfort as well as health, offering pain relief without being asked, adjusting examination room temperatures, providing clean gowns and sheets. And through all of it, they maintained that bewildering ease, that absence of fear or disgust, or the stern detachment that Japanese medical personnel adopted as professional necessity. Midori Nakamura, a nurse who had worked in a military hospital in Osaka throughout the firebombing campaigns, recalled in a 2001 interview her first encounter with an American Army nurse. She was treating Japanese civilians at a temporary clinic, burn victims and malnourished children. I was there seeking treatment for my own tuberculosis, which I had contracted in the hospital wards. She examined me with the same care she gave everyone else, enemy or ally. She looked concerned when she found the extent of my illness. She said something to the translator about antibiotics and rest and good nutrition, and she smiled at me, not pityingly, but encouragingly, as if recovery were possible. as if I were worth saving. In Japan, we had been taught that our lives had value only in service. If we could no longer serve, we should die quietly and not burden others. But she was treating me as if my life had inherent worth, as if keeping me alive was important simply because I was human. This was a revolution I had no framework to understand. The antibiotics themselves became symbols of this alternate value system. Penicillin and sulfa drugs, distributed by American medical teams, saved thousands of Japanese lives in the chaotic months after surrender. For those who received these medications, often at no cost, the drugs represented not just biochemical intervention, but a different calculus of human worth. The Americans were healing their enemies, spending resources to preserve lives that had no strategic value, operating from a logic that seemed to place individual human survival above collective military necessity. Japanese military medicine had adopted a brutal triage system that prioritized soldiers who could return to combat and quietly withheld resources from those whose recovery would be slow or uncertain. Nurses were taught to steel themselves against compassion, to see patients as military resources rather than suffering individuals. The American medical personnel, with their antibiotics and their smiles, and their assumption that every life deserved maximal effort at preservation, represented a fundamental challenge to this system. The occupation bureaucracy, despite its many failures and blind spots, operated on principles of due process and individual rights that contrasted sharply with Japanese military and civilian governance. Japanese women who found themselves navigating occupation procedures discovered that they could appeal decisions, that they could request explanations, that the systems in place assumed they had agency and standing as individuals, rather than merely as members of a collective group assigned. Collective punishment or collective mercy forms were provided in Japanese as well as English. Translation services were available. Mistakes could be corrected. The machinery moved slowly, but it acknowledged the people moving through it as people rather than as units to be processed or problems to be solved. And the American women staffing this machinery treated their work with a seriousness that suggested they believed in what they were doing, that they thought procedures and rights and individual consideration actually mattered. Ayako Ishikawa, who had worked in the civilian administration of military conscription before the surrender, found herself on the other side of bureaucratic processing in October 1945. She recalled in her memoir, published in 1989, "I had spent 3 years sending men to die, processing their paperwork with mechanical efficiency, ignoring their individual circumstances because individual circumstances were not relevant to military necessity. Now I was filling out forms about my own work history, my own skills, my own circumstances." The American woman reviewing my documents asked me questions about my experience, about what kind of work I wanted to do in the reconstruction. She asked what I wanted. No one had ever asked me what I wanted. I had no answer. I had been trained to have no wants except what I was told to want. She smiled and said something the translator rendered as, "Think about it. We can talk again next week." Next week. As if I had time. As if my preferences mattered. As if the future were something I had a right to shape. The concept of future-oriented planning from a position of individual agency was, for many Japanese women, almost unintelligible after years of total mobilization. They had learned to live in perpetual emergency, where all resources and all labor were dedicated to immediate military necessity. Long-term planning was the exclusive province of high military command and the imperial government. Individual futures were not something one shaped. They were something one endured or failed to endure. The American women, with their smiles and their questions and their assumption that Japanese women might have preferences and goals and aspirations, suggested an alternate temporal structure, one where the present was not merely a series of emergencies to survive, but a platform from which to imagine and build different futures. This shift from survival consciousness to future consciousness marked a profound psychological transformation for many of the Japanese women who spent extended time working with occupation forces. It was not a simple or painless transformation. It required acknowledging that the emergency logic that had structured their entire adult lives had been, at least in part, a mechanism of control rather than necessity. It required confronting the possibility that their suffering had been instrumentalized, that the sacrifices demanded of them had served not the nation, but the narrow interests of a military caste that had driven Japan into disaster. The American women, with their abundance and their smiles and their confidence, were not deliberately trying to convert Japanese women to democratic ideology. They were simply being themselves, operating within the framework of their own cultural assumptions. But in being themselves, in treating their own comfort as legitimate, in exercising authority without apology, in smiling without fear, in eating without guilt, in planning futures as if individual desires mattered, they became living refutations of the totalizing ideology that had governed Japanese wartime society. By early 1946, as the occupation settled into a stable routine and reconstruction efforts began in earnest, more Japanese women found themselves working alongside American personnel in various capacities. They served as translators, clerks, teachers in schools being reformed along democratic principles, liaisons between occupation authorities and Japanese civilian government. In these roles, they observed American working culture over extended periods and absorbed, often unconsciously, its underlying assumptions. They saw American women negotiate with male colleagues, not from subordinate positions but as peers with different areas of expertise. They saw American women express disagreement without sabotaging their professional relationships. They saw American women receive criticism, acknowledge mistakes, learn from errors, and continue working without being destroyed by shame. They saw American women mentor each other, share information freely, celebrate each other's successes without viewing those successes as threats to their own standing. All of this was accompanied by the smiles, the constant, inexplicable smiles. Smiles of greeting in the morning. Smiles of satisfaction when work went well. Smiles of rueful humor when work went poorly. Smiles of encouragement when someone struggled. Smiles of celebration when goals were achieved. Smiles that seemed to emerge from some deep reservoir of security, from the certainty that one's basic worth was not contingent on perfect performance, that mistakes were not catastrophes, that life contained possibilities for joy even in difficult circumstances. Sachiko Ito, who worked as a secretary in the Civil Information and Education section of the occupation government, described in a 1996 interview the cumulative impact of these observations. I began to smile too, not the formal smile we were taught to offer to superiors, not the submissive smile meant to deflect anger. I began to smile because I felt something like lightness. The American women treated me as a colleague. They asked my opinion on how to translate certain concepts. They invited me to lunch. They showed me photographs of their families and asked about mine. They were interested in me as a person, not as a function. And slowly I began to remember that I was a person, that I had thoughts and feelings that existed independently of my usefulness. The smile was the outward sign of this remembering. The transformation was neither universal nor uncontested. Many Japanese women, particularly those from families with strong military connections or those who had lost loved ones to American bombing raids, found the American presence unbearable regardless of how many smiles accompanied it. They viewed the friendliness as a mask for domination, the abundance as evidence of the materialism and spiritual emptiness they had been taught defined American culture. They maintained their commitment to traditional values, interpreting the behavior of American women as proof of moral decay rather than as evidence of an alternate social model. But for others, the encounter with American women's unself-conscious confidence planted seeds that would germinate in the decades to come. The new Japanese Constitution, drafted under American guidance and adopted in 1947, granted women's suffrage and established legal equality between the sexes, provisions that would have been unthinkable in pre-war or wartime Japan. The road from legal equality to social equality proved long and uneven, and many of the patriarchal structures of Japanese society proved remarkably resilient. But the constitutional foundation enabled subsequent generations of Japanese women to claim rights and opportunities their mothers had never imagined possible. The women who had directly encountered American occupation forces, who had witnessed alternate models of female competence and authority, became part of the transmission mechanism through which new possibilities entered Japanese culture. They raised daughters in the 1950s and 60s who grew up with the legal right to vote, to own property, to pursue higher education. Those daughters, in turn, would lead movements for workplace equality, reproductive rights, and fuller inclusion in public life. The chain of influence was not straightforward or deterministic, but neither was it absent. The smiles that had so disoriented Japanese military women in 1945 represented more than American cultural habits. They represented a different relationship to power, a different understanding of strength, a different architecture of human relations. In militaristic Japan, strength had been defined as the capacity to endure suffering without complaint, to suppress individual needs in service of collective goals, to face death without fear. Authority had required sternness, distance, the elimination of personal warmth in favor of hierarchical clarity. The American women who smiled while exercising authority, who were kind without being weak, who maintained their individuality without being selfish, who enjoyed comfort without being soft. These women demonstrated that the dichotomies Japanese women had been taught were natural and inevitable were actually culturally constructed and therefore changeable. By 1950, as the occupation formally ended and Japan regained sovereignty, the psychological landscape of Japanese women who had encountered American occupation forces had been permanently altered. They had learned that women could smile without apology, eat without guilt, work without self-erasure, and exercise authority without becoming masculine. They had learned that abundance did not automatically lead to moral decay, that comfort did not preclude strength, that democracy extended to women did not destroy social order but enriched it. These lessons were not always welcome. They created internal conflicts that some women never fully resolved, tensions between the values they had absorbed during the war years and the alternate possibilities they had witnessed afterward. But the conflicts themselves were generative, creating the psychological conditions for questioning, for imagining different futures, for refusing to accept that the way things had always been was the way things must always be. The food, the abundant, casually shared, guilt-free food, remained in memory as a sacrament of this alternate possibility. Every sandwich offered without ceremony, every coffee break taken without apology, every meal consumed with evident pleasure rather than grim necessity, had encoded the message that life could be about something other than survival and sacrifice, that human beings, including female human beings, deserved not just to exist, but to flourish. That wanting things, good food, comfortable clothing, interesting work, personal happiness, was not selfish or shameful but simply human. This was a revolutionary message in a culture that had spent decades teaching women that their highest purpose was to disappear into service, that their greatest virtue was to want nothing for themselves, that their value lay entirely in their usefulness to men, to children, to the state, to anything and anyone except themselves. The American women who occupied Japan after 1945 had not set out to deliver this message. They had come to do their jobs, to process the paperwork of occupation, to manage the logistics of reconstruction, to provide medical care and administrative services, and all the mundane work required to transform an enemy nation into an allied democracy. But in doing their jobs while being themselves, competent and feminine, authoritative and warm, professional and smiling, they became vectors of an ideology they might not have articulated, but which they embodied nonetheless. Years later, in the testimonies and memoirs and oral histories collected from Japanese women who experienced those first encounters, a common thread emerges: the bewilderment of witnessing someone who was simultaneously powerful and happy, who smiled without fear, who treated her own well-being as legitimate, who exercised authority without cruelty, who shared abundance without creating debt. These combinations seemed impossible, contradictory, destabilizing. They violated everything these women had been taught about the nature of strength and sacrifice and femininity and power. But they were real. The American women were real. Their smiles were real. Their confidence was real. Their abundance was real. And once seen, this reality could not be unseen. It lodged in memory, in the stories women told their daughters, in the quiet refusal to accept that subordination and suffering were inevitable or natural. It became part of the sediment from which post-war Japan was rebuilt, grain by grain, choice by choice, one woman after another deciding that what she had seen was real and that it pointed towards something better. The epilogue to this story is written in the slow evolution of Japanese women's social, economic, and political participation over the subsequent decades. It is written in the increasing percentages of girls completing secondary and higher education. It is written in the entry of women into professions previously closed to them. It is written in the political activism of women's organizations, demanding fuller realization of constitutional guarantees. It is written in the simple fact that Japanese women born after 1945 inherited a different set of possibilities than their mothers had known, however incomplete and contested those possibilities remained. The transformation was partial, compromised by the resilience of patriarchal structures and the conservative turn in Japanese politics during the Cold War era. Legal equality on paper proved far easier to achieve than substantive equality in practice. But the encounter with American women's unself-conscious confidence in 1945 had opened a window that could never be fully closed. Once Japanese women had seen that women could smile without fear, could exercise authority without apology, could pursue their own well-being without destroying social cohesion. The old justifications for subordination lost some of their power to compel absolute submission. In the end, what stunned the female Japanese officers who encountered American occupation forces was not military technology or strategic superiority or even the material abundance, though all of these were staggering. What stunned them was the evidence that women granted genuine equality could flourish rather than fail, that confidence did not require cruelty, that strength did not require suffering, that authority did not require the elimination of joy. This was the lesson contained in every casual smile, every shared meal, every moment of competence displayed without self-consciousness or apology. This was the meaning encoded in the lipstick and the laughter, the sandwiches and the second helpings, the gentle touches and the professional disagreements resolved without violence or shame. This was the truth that years of militaristic conditioning had tried to suppress but could not erase, that there were other ways to be human, other ways to be woman, other ways to build a society. The smiles said, "You do not have to be afraid all the time. You do not have to erase yourself to have value. You do not have to suffer to be strong. You can want things and eat things and enjoy things and still be worthy of respect. You can be yourself fully and completely, and the world will not end." For women who had been taught that their highest virtue was self-negation, that their greatest contribution was silence, that their worth lay entirely in usefulness to others, these smiles were more destabilizing than defeat itself. They suggested that everything they had sacrificed, everything they had endured, everything they had accepted as natural and necessary had been based on a lie. Not a small lie, but a foundational lie about human nature and human possibility. And once that lie was exposed, once even a few women had glimpsed the possibility of living otherwise, the reconstruction of Japanese society could never be merely a restoration of what had been destroyed. It had to be, at least partially, a building of something new, something that made space for women to smile without fear, to eat without guilt, to work without self-erasure, to claim their full humanity without apology. This was the quiet revolution, contained in those first bewildering encounters on the docks of Yokohama in September 1945. In the processing centers and hospitals and administrative offices where Japanese women met American confidence face to face. This was the transformation encoded in every sandwich shared, every cigarette offered, every medical procedure explained, every smile given freely without fear or calculation. The Americans went home eventually, back to their imperfect democracy with its own struggles for equality and justice. They did not know, could not know, the long-term impact of their simple presence. They had been doing their jobs, serving their time, managing the chaos of occupation and reconstruction. They had smiled because smiling was natural to them, because they came from a culture that had not taught them to fear the expression of ordinary human warmth. But in the eyes and memories of the Japanese women who had watched them, who had received their smiles and their sandwiches, and their casual assumptions of equality, they had been more than themselves. They had been proof that the rigid hierarchies of militaristic Japan were constructed rather than natural, evidence that strength could coexist with kindness, that authority did not require the elimination of joy, that women could be fully human without destroying the social order. And in that proof, however incomplete and complicated, lay the seeds of a different future, one where Japanese women might someday smile without fear, eat without guilt, work without self-erasure, and claim for themselves the fullness of being they had glimpsed in their former enemies. The road to that future proved longer and more difficult than anyone anticipated in 1945, and its full realization remains contested and incomplete even now. But it began with a smile, offered across the ruins of empire, suggesting that the world might be otherwise than they had been taught, that human beings deserved not just to survive but to flourish, that the absence of fear was not weakness but the foundation of everything worth building.